It was made official on July 1st, and now there has been much discussion about Oklahoma and its fit in the SEC and its competition level in entering the SEC. We will dive into that conversation. So get your arguments ready. Oklahoma versus the SEC. We're talking Sooners for the next 60. We appreciate you being here at the Voice of College Football. Of course, leave those comments and questions there in the chat. We appreciate the super chat contributions as well. Our old buddy Jason Ray's here. Good to see Jason. Jason, how's it going?
Good, Mark. Thanks for having me as always.
Of course. And let's get to the nuts and bolts of what is fact at this point, and that's the commitments of a number of players here in the last few weeks. And I'll just set it up this way. There have been 4 committed here just in the past, let's say 2 weeks. CJ Nixon, the number 1 rated player in the state, would be the headliner. And we can certainly go down the list or we can look forward. But what are your thoughts about Oklahoma's efforts on the recruiting path?
Yeah, Oklahoma's doing a really good job right now, Mark. As you mentioned, there's been quite a few as of late. CJ Nixon, who's the number 1 player in the state of Oklahoma out of Weatherford High School in Weatherford, Oklahoma. And when you look at Oklahoma at this point right now, Mark, Oklahoma has 21 commitments solidified for the 2025 class, which they're doing the work a little bit earlier than maybe in years past, but they still got a little bit of meat on the bone. But yeah, there's 2 or 3 guys that as you have here on the list in terms of their top guys, 2 or 3 they're from the state of Oklahoma, right? You've got Tristan Haynes from Carl Albert. You've got Elijah Thomas from Chakotah. So Oklahoma's really doing a good job on, and I think this was one of Venable's areas of focus when he came on to Oklahoma, because they had not that they were recruiting Oklahoma bad, but there was a lot of in-state talent, especially some of the top in-state talent that was going elsewhere. And so he's done a very good job in really shoring that up. And so when you look at this class as a whole, number 8 overall according to 247 rankings, but in this will kind of delve into our conversation I'm sure that we'll have a little bit later. It's 8th in the country, 5th in the SEC, right? So that's a much different look in terms of what that recruiting class is. But having said that, for Oklahoma to be up there, and I think that SEC patch that me and you've talked about this a long time over the last couple of years, but that SEC patch on your jersey means a lot, right? Oklahoma has done a very good job with Venables when he's been here, but even more so, I think you're going to see that recruiting go up a little bit. Now, I think the proof is certainly going to be in the pudding in terms of what Oklahoma's going to be able to do on the field this year, but even more specifically, Oklahoma's been able to step up their defensive recruiting over the last few years. So yeah, being in a position with 21 commitments here on July 11th, still having about, I think, 4 or 5 that are pretty close to committing, I think is a very good sign going into this year's season.
Cortez Mills, a top 25 player out of the state of Florida, top 200 player nationally, top 20 roughly wide receiver. Amarian Robinson, the safety, 42nd ranked in the country at his position. The number 3 player out of the state of Arkansas, Darius Afalaba, is an interior offensive lineman. Those are the most recent commits. So when you mention some targets and some guys that are on the board, is there anybody in particular that you're eyeing?
I think the crown jewel, so to speak, for this class is Michael Fasusi, 5-star offensive lineman out of Louisville, Texas. He is the guy. I think it looks like it's probably between Oklahoma and Texas right now. 5-star, number 27 overall. He looks like he's probably maybe top 5 offensive tackle in the country, and so he's. I think it looks good for Oklahoma right now. I think Oklahoma leads by a fairly considerable margin, but Texas is obviously in the loop there with him being a Texas kid. So being able to secure his commitment will be really, really critical, specifically when the offensive line commitment that they lost to Missouri last week as well. So he's one guy. And then you got a couple of defensive linemen. One, interestingly enough, that Oklahoma's in on from West Fargo, North Dakota. Cade Pidzeric he's a 3-star defensive lineman. He's a guy that Oklahoma feels really good about where they're at there. Another defensive lineman from Miami. Looks like that's kind of a three-team race between Miami, Oklahoma, and interestingly enough, USC. His name is Floyd Boucard, 3-star defensive lineman out of Miami, 6'3", 315, top 50 defensive lineman in the country. And then another one that kind of keep your eyes on is Christian Jones, 4-star linebacker from Omaha, Nebraska. Oklahoma's in on him. So those are some of the ones that look like could be the next dominoes to fall in this class for Oklahoma should things align in that way.
All right, folks. Once again, comments and questions there in the chat. Keep in mind, we've got an SEC channel that's growing, and we would love for you to be part of it. The link is in the description section. So go to the SEC channel and check it out. All right, this is going to be a heck of a discussion because I enjoy these kind of conversations. So, of course, the SEC is the best conference in college football. Folks, if anybody out there wants to debate that, please call me. Could that change? Yes, with the additions to the Big Ten and Oklahoma, Texas, obviously huge additions to the SEC. I would actually say that the initial additions, Oklahoma, Texas, compared to USC, UCLA, favor the SEC. But then you add Oregon, Washington to the Big Ten, and I am certainly open to continuing to evaluate the situation. But as of right now, the SEC is the best conference, and that's been the case for 15 plus years. So it was debatable for a long time, and then the SEC took over, and it's really not been debatable. That can be proven on so many different levels. Okay, what about Oklahoma transitioning to the SEC and what that looks like? And of course, that's been the question since the announcement was made a couple of years ago. There are those ardent SEC supporters that believe that Oklahoma is just going to be this mid program and going to tack on a ton of losses to their record, and they're not strong enough in the trenches, don't have the elite talent in enough areas to compete at the top. And then there are also variations of that across the board. And then, of course, as you well know, Jason, as well as I do, that much of that narrative comes from Oklahoma's postseason performances, of which they played a barn burner, one of the great historic games in the history of the playoff against Georgia at the Rose Bowl, but the other efforts were not close to being good enough. All right, so you took off before we started to record on a comment that was made by Barrett Saley. But again, this has been a topic for quite a long time, and the rubber will finally meet the road here in a couple months. But as of right now, we can continue to speculate.
Yeah, you're right, Mark. I think, and to your point, it's a very interesting conversation. As we talked about previously, Oklahoma fans, Oklahoma as a whole, just a program in general, is used to being on top. When you look at the Big 8, when you look at the Big 12, Oklahoma has more Big 12 titles than I believe, and don't quote me on this, but all other teams combined in the history of the Big 12. So when you look at that and look at coming into the SEC, I think there's a lot of different prevailing thoughts that's coming from fans and media and just people that follow the program very closely, that there's a school of thought that Oklahoma is going to be able to fit into the SEC just fine, kind of almost a lift and shift type of situation. They're going to be among the top 3 or 4 teams next year, and each and every year be fighting for that SEC title. And then there's some people that are even outside of the Oklahoma program that really just think, okay, Oklahoma might take some beatings early on, and not necessarily beatings like a Vanderbilt or something like that, right? But just in terms of where they have been historically from the Big 12. And as we mentioned, I tend to think it's a little bit of a somewhere in between, right? So to your point on the Barrett Sally conversation, I think he compared Oklahoma to what Auburn has been in the SEC, and like you would have honestly, Mark, like you would have thought that they were comparing Oklahoma to Vanderbilt, right? Like so many people came after that comment, so many, and I don't necessarily me myself think it's a bad comment, right? So how many times over the last 10 or 15 years has Auburn beat Alabama? Auburn has won the national championship, played for a national championship, I should say. No, they won under Cam Newton. I'm sorry. Um, you know, and so many different opportunities there in the playoffs and been in that situation, being in a position to make the playoffs. So I don't really think that's a I don't think that's I think people took that as a slide, but I don't really think it is. And so, but yeah, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people think that Oklahoma, a lot of predictions here internally that I've seen 10-2, 11-1. And so I think the big difference, and this, people that cover the SEC, people that watch SEC football, the biggest difference between the Big 12 and the SEC is the line of scrimmage, right? That on the offense and defensive lines, and that's where, particularly on the defensive line, Oklahoma has struggled over the last few years. Now, I think what Venables has been able to do on the defensive side of the ball, they have gotten better each and every year. However, when you look at how Oklahoma played defensively early last year versus the last 5 or 6 games, Oklahoma gave the least amount of points that they gave up in a single game over their last 6 was 20 against West Virginia, right? And that schedule, particularly down the stretch, is really, really tough. Now, I think the schedule makers didn't really do Oklahoma any favors coming into the first year. I think if you look at Oklahoma and Texas does have Georgia, and then they have Michigan in non-conference, but they had they have the opportunity of not having quite as tough of a schedule as Oklahoma does in the SEC. In that late schedule, when you look at, you've got Maine, sliced in there, which helps. But you go over your last 4 weeks. You go to Ole Miss, you host Maine, you go to Missouri, you host Alabama, and you go to LSU. I mean, that's a very, very tough schedule to end the season, there. And so, I think the big thing that I think a lot of people have said about the SEC in general is, obviously you're not playing Georgia and Alabama every week, right? But by that token, the schedule is a grind, and so eventually, like, it catches up with you in terms of your depth and where you're at. So, and who knows where those teams will be when we get down to that mark. But you're looking at, for those last 5 games, top 12 teams, at least preseason, right? Like, and so that's really tough to look at. And so when on the outside looking in, if Oklahoma was able to go 8-4 this year, that's, in my mind, that's a very, very good season. Very good season with the transition from the Big 12 to the SEC. But and I know, 8-4, 7-5, 8-4 is probably not going to cut it for very long for Oklahoma, even in the SEC. Now, I think they'll get a little bit of benefit of the doubt with the first year into the SEC and getting acclimated to that and such. But I think that's just going to be so interesting to watch how, number one, how Oklahoma navigates that schedule. Yeah, the back half is tough, but then you got Tulane early on in the non-conference, I mean, Oklahoma fans know how that game went a few years ago. And then you've got Tennessee, and you go to Auburn, one of the toughest places to play in the SEC. And so, yeah, there's no. I mean, everybody that's plays this year in and year out in the SEC knows this, but it's going to be a grind each and every week. There's very, very few off weeks, and so how Oklahoma is able to really navigate that and change the way that they play to to that SEC schedule will be very interesting to watch this year.
Vanderbilt is, of course, the equivalent of what Kansas has always been. That's your equivalent of, okay, that's the game on the schedule that's a gimme. And you're going to see that roughly half the time, is how often you're going to see any of these opponents that are not designated rivals that the SEC is going to pin with that particular team every year. So you're going to see Vandy every other year. Now, when I look at a game like South Carolina, I put that in the category of, and Mississippi State, Arkansas would be in this category right now. That Oklahoma, of course, needs to win that game, will be a substantial favorite in that game unless things drastically change with these two teams before that. But Oklahoma and anyone else will leave that game knowing that they've played a football game. Like, there are athletes, there are some NFL players on those teams. They will be hard-hitting games, and they're not a joke. And there have been, in addition to Kansas, a couple of those games for Oklahoma in the past in the Big 12. In terms of the Auburn comment, I understand the angst of the Oklahoma fan thinking, okay, we're a top 5 program. And if you go with the recency bias, of course, Auburn's not been good since roughly 2017. So the last 5 years or so, Auburn's not been a good football team. And so there's a recency bias that, okay, Auburn is what we've seen for the last 5 years. Well, to Jason's point, more historically, recent history, Auburn played for a national championship 10 years ago. They won a national championship 3 years before that. They went undefeated, did not get an opportunity, ironically, to play for a national championship because of Oklahoma after the 2004 season. So Auburn's certainly nowhere close to the consistency of Oklahoma. But when they've got the right coach and they're operating their program correctly, they can peak and be a really good program and be a top 5 to 10 program. Now you level that out with everything else that they bring to the table when they're down, and I'd say Auburn's a top 15 program in college football. That's not Oklahoma's status of top 5, but the comment was intended to, I'm guessing, take the increase in scheduling and the transition to the league into account. And we know that Oklahoma's not quite on their A game right now with the transition from Lincoln Riley to Brent Venables, and Brent Venables needing to restructure this roster and revamp it. What I find interesting, Jason, is also the national narrative of, and I'm not saying it's incorrect, but I'm saying it is a possibility to be incorrect, but there's just an assumption that Texas is ready for this. Oklahoma's not necessarily ready for this. And sure, Texas has done all the right things here in the last year to 2 years in recruiting, of course, and then performing on the field this past season. But that's one season. And I'm expecting Texas to have a really good team and a good season. And they are a top 3 or 4 team in the country, according to just about everyone. But Oklahoma did win that football game, and Texas did dodge some bullets against the likes of Houston and Kansas State in overtime. You know, they were pretty close to not playing in a college football playoff, whereas Oklahoma was pretty close to playing in a college football playoff, or at least being in the Big 12 championship game. But they had the loss to Kansas, of course, and I'm blanking on their other loss. Oklahoma State. Yeah. 2 one-score games, close games. There were some calls in the Oklahoma State game that could have went either way. So I'll use another team in another section of the country to prove my point even further. Georgia Tech went 7-6 last year. They won a bowl game. And considering how bad they've been for the last 5 years, that's considered okay. They're taking steps in the right direction. There's a good feel, good vibe, good perception of Georgia Tech heading into this season as continuing to build their program, not being any kind of threat or factor. If Mario Cristobal takes a knee against Georgia Tech, they never go to a bowl game to get the seventh win. They're a 5-7 football team, and there's a much different perception of what the trajectory of that program is, and they had nothing to do with that. So I'm just drawing a similar conclusion with Oklahoma, Texas. Oklahoma wins the game on the field. They lose 2 one-score games. Texas ekes by Houston, Kansas State, and maybe some others that I'm not catching. And now suddenly Texas is a top 3 team, and Oklahoma's, in many people's minds, an afterthought. I know that's not going to be the preseason ranking. I would expect it to be 12 or 13 in the country, somewhere in that range, going into the season. But I think people are generally giving Texas this pass as they're ready suddenly, when this entire time since it's been announced, it was like, well, Texas is ringing up 5, 6, 7 win seasons in the Big 12. How are they going to compete? And now it's suddenly flipped to Oklahoma's the one in trouble.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Mark. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that's been a little bit of a topic of conversation in my local circle here. Exactly the way you put it, the narrative is Texas is much more ready to compete in the SEC than Oklahoma is, and I don't know if it's more of a recency bias in terms of, hey, Texas went to Tuscaloosa and beat Alabama last year. Texas made the college football playoff last year. They won the Big 12 last year. I don't know if it's that, but to your point, Oklahoma's actually beaten Texas 9 out of the last 11 times, beat them last year, and really a fantastic game in the Cotton Bowl. Maybe it has to do with the schedule that Texas has related to where Oklahoma has and in year one. But yes, it's very strange, I think, to me, to look at Texas as so much more ready to compete and ready to play immediately, and ready to be a challenger immediately in the SEC. I've seen, when you look at these predictions early on, they're fun to look at and talk about, right? But I've seen a lot of people think that Texas is perhaps the second best team in the SEC, no worse than 3 or 4 right now. And so I don't know. I mean, like I said, that with them early on, they have Michigan. I can't remember if that's the second or third week of the season, but early on, we'll get a taste of where, certainly of where Texas is as they start that SEC conference. But yeah, it's a little bit, and I think that's a great comparison when you talk about Georgia Tech as well. But yeah, it's all brand new, and I think further to that disrespect, I think when SEC Media Days is soon here, right? And so I fully expect Oklahoma to be probably in terms of where they are, projected to finish, probably in that 6 to 8 range, right? I mean, you have to think you probably have some sort of, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss, LSU in that top 5-ish range, and some certainly Georgia will be, I think, probably number 1. But yeah, I mean, again, and when that comes out, it's going to trigger fans again. I mean, there was I've talked about this quite a bit, but love watching their podcast. Gabe Eichert and Teddy Lehman mentioned that last week, that Oklahoma fans are going to lose their crap when they know this, like, what's going on. Why is Oklahoma picked middle of the pack in the league? Well, it's because of all these other teams in the SEC, and so I think it's a big. No one has the expectation that Oklahoma's going to. I mean, at least I don't think many people have an expectation that Oklahoma's going to go in and win the SEC year one. But I think a big I think stepping stone from them is how they compete in the SEC year one. You had that first part of the schedule up just a second ago, and the first, I think, 5 games before Texas, and it's very conceivable. I think for Oklahoma to get to that 8-4, 9-3 range, where or that would be a really good season for them. You've got to go. I think at a minimum, you got to go 4-1 in those first five. 5-0. You talked about Auburn. Absolutely agree. They're a little bit down based on where they were, where they have been. So this is a big year for them, right? And that's going to be one of their big games early on in the year. And Oklahoma, there was a lot of and going back to this Oklahoma and Texas thing, there was a it's interesting. Like Texas has been the team over. I mean, even when they haven't been great, Mark, Texas has been the team that just sort of puffs their chests out and like, we're Texas, right? Well, I know you probably saw this, but Quinn Ewers said when we was talking about the schedule, he came out and I'm paraphrasing, of course, here, made a comment such as Texas is everyone's Super Bowl. And then I saw a couple of other tweets by saying this is a conference that has Georgia and Alabama. Slow your roll a little bit on Texas being everyone's Super Bowl. You're still new. So I think that's interesting. I think that's a little bit of a different perspective that maybe Texas has coming into the Big 12 just internally that than what Oklahoma has. But yeah, if Oklahoma if they can find a way to go 5-0, then I think you're in a really good spot heading into Red River and setting yourselves up to have that 8-4, 9-3 season. Now, if you go through here and you are, I think, worst case 3-2, then you go into Red River. It's like that's an absolute must win for us to get where we would like to go in the SEC. And who knows, Mark? I don't know that we have with this 12-team playoff. We don't have a really good feel of what gets you in or what's going to get you in, right? Like 9-3 in the SEC probably gets you in that discussion where you're in a good spot, especially if you're Oklahoma, to make that 12-team playoff. And so if somehow you can get to 9-3, that would be great. Now this is just me being not necessarily pessimistic, but just kind of looking at where Oklahoma is right now. To get to 9-3, you think you've got Ole Miss, you've got LSU, you've got Alabama, you've got Tennessee, you've got Texas, and then you can even throw Missouri in there in terms of those. That's probably the best 6 teams, that you're going to play this year. To get to 9-3, you're going to have to split those, right? Which means probably either a win at Ole Miss or at Missouri, and perhaps either a win against Alabama at home or at LSU. So those are very, very tough what ifs. This isn't talking about going and getting a win in Stillwater or going and getting a win in Manhattan. These are, or getting a win against, I don't know, whoever you want to say in the Big 12 at home. So these are much different looking teams and looking rosters. So I mean, yeah, I think the key as we and we'll have much more time to dissect that, but to get off to a good start is really good. And I think luckily starting out with Temple and even Houston will be a good trendsetter for Oklahoma to start the season. And then I think it gradually the talent level on the other sideline gradually increases. Now I think Tennessee's got a better roster than Auburn coming into the season without a doubt, but just the kind of the degree of difficulty with facing Tennessee at home, plus then going to Auburn might look a little different. But yeah, if they get off to a good start, then maybe 8-4, 9-3 is possible, navigating that tough stretch down the stretch.
Yeah, the Temple Houston Open, and then also to a certain extent Tulane, although they were a really good team the last 2 seasons now with a new head coach. But Temple Houston allows you the luxury of working on things, tuning things up. There's not the Alabama, Wisconsin, Texas, Michigan, USC, LSU right out of the gate, week one, and others across the board, Georgia, Clemson, where you get hit in the mouth in week one and you better be ready. Now, the other team has that same challenge that they don't have game reps to try to clean things up, but I'm sure any coach would rather be in the position of easing into the season and working on a number of things. What strikes me as maybe a different way to frame it, Oklahoma's schedules in the past in the Big 12 versus what they're facing in the SEC, is what I'll call circle your calendar kind of games, where this Oklahoma program has been as consistent as anyone the last 25 years. I think really, we're delving back into pre-Saban. So basically, it's Ohio State and Oklahoma have been the most consistent programs in the country in just churning out 11-win seasons. So what the schedule looks like for those kind of teams is basically, okay, and the Big 12 having played every team in the conference, so you play everyone, is that okay? Kansas State's supposed to be good this year. Oklahoma State's supposed to be good this year. Texas is Texas. We always have to take them seriously, even if they only won 5 or 6 games. But circle 2 games, maybe 3 with Texas, and that's our season. The other ones are almost give me wins, and the fans are just basically waiting for 2 or 3 games. You look at this schedule, and once you get into the SEC, Tennessee, who's going to win that game? I have no idea. It's a toss-up. I give Oklahoma a slight edge because they're at home. At Auburn, Oklahoma should be better. They should be a small favorite, but they're playing on the road at one of the more difficult places to play. And for any Oklahoma fans who aren't familiar, even a 6-7 Auburn team had Bama down to a 4th and 32 to win the game last year at their place, and had a tie game with Georgia with 4 or 5 minutes left. So that's generally a toss-up. Then Texas, toss-up at best. Okay, you should beat South Carolina, but then as you ran down the home stretch, Ole Miss on the road, Missouri on the road, Alabama at LSU on the road. At best, they're all toss-ups. Like every game on the schedule except for South Carolina is basically a circle the calendar. Like this is a big game.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, not really thinking about it from a win-loss perspective, Mark. I do think there's a fair amount of people, Oklahoma fans, that are genuinely excited about the schedule year in and year out, and on what that looks like. Not having, there's no disrespect to these teams, Iowa State, Texas Tech, Kansas, some of these other teams that are probably not at the same level, certainly as like perennial Oklahoma and Texas, but having these toss-up games every single week, I think is exciting. It's exciting for me. I think, I don't know how you feel personally about this, but going into the 2024 season, I'm excited as an overall football fan, not necessarily just an OU guy, but as an overall fan, just so incredibly excited to watch the matchups with the conference realignment. Off the top, you're talking about SEC and Big Ten. Certainly, SEC is the best conference in the country. Now, I think the Big Ten is close, very, very close. Particularly as you look at, this season with Oregon and Ohio State certainly being 2 of the top probably 5-6 teams in the country coming in, and maybe Georgia and Alabama are probably there as well, right? So, but I think this is a really, really exciting schedule for Oklahoma. Exciting to look and see, how they match up, how they measure up to to what this grind will be each and every week. But yeah, lots of toss-up games as you mentioned, and there's very few weeks off. Even if there's you look at the bottom half of the schedule as we talked about, yeah, it's really a grind. But the luckily between Auburn and you got an off week between Auburn and Texas that'll help that gamut. But Tennessee at Auburn and then Texas at the Cotton Bowl, that's a really tough 3-week stretch as well. But yeah, I think it's, for me, just being able to watch, I think it'll be very, very exciting. Just watching the schedule week in and week out.
Yeah, while I don't care for realignment, I wish there was still a Pac-12 because I like college football the way it was and the regionalization. And for as much as I don't want ACC teams to go away or be trembling in fear that they're going to be extinct, what this has done is, yes, it's consolidated the better programs together. When Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA go to the Big Ten, well, that limits the number of lesser teams that you play, and the same thing with Oklahoma and Texas in the SEC. So it just creates better games. And to the point of these being generally toss-up games, because I think a couple people in the chat kind of questioned whether these are truly toss-up games that we're noting. The Auburn game, I just looked up the preseason point spread, and I think we agree that other than South Carolina, Auburn is the next quote unquote easiest game for Oklahoma on the SEC schedule. And they are right now a 2.5-point favorite.
Yep.
It's not much.
Well, that's life, and it's life in the SEC. You'd mentioned Auburn last year. I believe these were back to back weeks. I don't know if it was back to back or there was a game or a bye in between. Auburn got handled at home by New Mexico State late in the year last year. And to your point, they had Alabama beaten late in that game, and just a miracle play by Jalen Milroe allowed Alabama to advance. And obviously we know what happened from there from a playoff perspective. But yeah, there's a lot of, there was a comment in the chat here about SEC, a lot of upsets in the SEC, and that's absolutely correct. Like when you have this many teams that are really kind of log jammed, right, and you have and you have that, there's going to be some upsets, and there's going to be some things. But it's hard to, there's a reason why it's hard to get these wins on the road. So Oklahoma's a better team than Auburn. I feel pretty confident in that. But the home field advantage is really, really big in some of those games. And when you looked at some of the road games that Oklahoma played last year, and won a lot of those games, right? So Cincinnati early in the year, they won that game 20-6. Then you had those back-to-back losses against Kansas and Oklahoma State. Kansas was a 38-33 loss. Oklahoma State, I believe, 27-24. But Oklahoma had a lot of, we've talked a couple years ago when Oklahoma went 6-6, they had so many close games that they just weren't able to find a way to win. And Oklahoma sort of kind of cut that in half last year with some of those close wins against Texas, close win against UCF at home, 31-29, close win against BYU on the road. But as Oklahoma was I think 8 points difference away from being 12-0 last year, but they were also 12, 13 points away from being maybe 6-6 again. So and that's going to be the same thing this year, right? There's going to be the margin for error is going to be much less than it has been in the past. And I think I'm sure we'll get into this more, but the line of scrimmage is going to be interesting for Oklahoma, particularly on the offensive line. Oklahoma lost basically their entire offensive line, and it's going to be. This isn't not a term of derogatory nature, but it'll be a little bit of a patchwork offensive line in terms of, and I don't, like I said, I don't mean that in a bad way, but there's several transfers coming in. There's several kids that didn't play a ton last year, either by injury or just down in the depth chart. So breaking in a new offensive line, it's really good that they've got a couple of games to kind of get that solidified. But breaking in that new offensive line is going to be tough. And it was anybody who watched the spring game, it was a disaster. I mean, there's not really any other way to put it. Now, part of that was injuries and stuff like that. Kids weren't ready, but Jackson Arnold just really didn't have a whole lot of time to be effective. And so if Oklahoma can be solid on the offensive line, I think they've got the skill position players. Jackson Arnold is young, obviously, but even his youth, they've got a lot of talent at the wide receiver corps. They've got a lot of talent at the running back position. And I think they can score some points. Now, defensively, it's always going to be the same, right? It's always been the same real kind of conversation around Oklahoma over the last 15 years. Can they defend well enough to compete for a national championship? Can they do that? Now, I think for the first time, gosh, Mark, probably 15, 20 years, Oklahoma probably has an NFL player at every level of the defense. Dominique Williams, the transfer in from TCU, he's an NFL guy. Danny Sussman at the linebacker position, he's an NFL guy. Billy Bowman in the secondary, he's an NFL guy. Do they have enough guys around him is going to be the key. So it's they lost a lot on the defensive line as well. But I think being able to patch that up is going to be critical. And how they, you don't worry it to me as much in the first half of the year. It's the back half of the year and how that depth will, kind of continue to present itself. And do they have enough quality depth to match up against these teams, particularly those last 4 or 5 games?
We appreciate you all being here at the Voice of College Football. This is our Oklahoma show. We got Jason Ray here, and Jason and I hope and intend to get together on a fairly regular basis, and we will keep you updated on when those times will be. So just keep subscribed here, hit the bell for the notifications. Therefore, when we go live, and we will make that known a couple days in advance. All right, Jason. I do want to do a deeper dive maybe in future weeks on that defense, because I was having the same thought the other day when asked about Oklahoma, that I was thinking this is the best defense since when? It should be. It's so
Yeah.
We could take a deeper dive in the future, but
Yeah, it definitely should be, Mark. Yeah, and to your point, we'll do a much deeper dive on that. Now, I think the one thing that you can think about is Oklahoma was really good defensively the first half of the year, right? Then there was a little bit of a struggle late in the year, right? Later in the year, I guess I would say. In certain instances, I think they played pretty well against West Virginia, pretty well against BYU for the most part, but gave up 38 to Kansas. Not too bad against Oklahoma State, but those last couple of games, particularly against TCU, I think that was like a 60. That was like prototypical Big 12, historically Big 12. I think it was like 68 to 45. Oklahoma won that game and gave up obviously a lot of points on the defensive side of the ball. But I think you got a glimpse of what Oklahoma will look like to a certain degree in that game against Arizona. Predictably, Jackson Arnold made some mistakes. Part of that was obviously lack of experience. Part of that was offensive line, and part of that was give credit to Arizona. But Oklahoma committed 6 turnovers in that game and still almost won the game. So I think that's going to be the thing. I think the prevailing thought, I think, for Oklahoma offensively. If the offensive line can give Jackson Arnold time, he's got all the skills. He has got he's got the measurables. He's quick. He's able to, he can run the football. He can make any throw on the field that you ask him to make. But there's going to be that with only having one start under his belt, there's there's going to be that situation where he's going to make some mistakes. But if they can give him some time, I think Oklahoma's going to be able to have some success offensively.
All right. Again, folks, Jason and I intend to get together on a fairly regular basis. So please subscribe, have those notifications ready and on, and we will let you know a few days in advance when we will get together for more Oklahoma Sooners live talk. And this is the best time to get locked in with us because, of course, we've got SEC Media Days coming very soon and then right into fall camp, and we're off and running from there. All right, Jason, I appreciate you being here. Good to see you, and we'll get together soon.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Mark.
All right, folks, we got a Michigan call-in show tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern time. That's over on the Michigan channel. So again, Michigan call-in show, 8 p.m. Eastern time. Join the guys over there doing an exceptional job covering the defending national champions. All right, we will see you all back here on OU Live next time.